This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this evening's lecture. I suppose I'm the warm-up act for this evening. My name is Michael McGregor, and I am the Robert Wolfe Director of the Wordsworth Trust. And the Wordsworth Trust is, for those of you who don't know about the Wordsworth Trust, we're a charity based up in the heart of the English Lake District, dedicated to the poet William Wordsworth. But our interests embrace the literature and culture of the Romantic period in its broadest context, so we're absolutely delighted to be associated with this evening's lecture by Richard Holmes. If you wish to find out more about the work of the Wordsworth Trust, myself and my colleagues are around, and we also have some information outside for you. It's a great pleasure for the Wordsworth Trust to be working with and in partnership with the Institute of English Studies at the University of London for a small organisation with, shall we say, quite a national profile. It's great for us to be able to reach out to London and to reach out to our many friends down here in London and the South East who support our work but can't always get up to the Lake District to see what we do firsthand. I'm very grateful in particular to Professor Warwick Gould of the Institute of English Studies and his colleague John Millington who've done so much to bring this all together. This is the third lecture in a collaborative programme between the Institute and the Wordsworth Trust. I'd also like to thank from the Wordsworth Trust side my colleagues Sally Robinson and Mark Baines who've done all the organising between Grasmere and here. That's all from me. It now gives me the very greatest pleasure to welcome William Sinclair, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of English Studies, who will chair this evening's lecture. Thank you.
As the other sponsor of this lecture is the John Coffin Memorial Fund, and the lecture is held in fulfilment of a gift by Arthur Charles Coffin, made in 1957 in memory of his father, John Coffin. Arthur Charles Coffin had been the Chief Education Officer in Bradford, and the sum that he bequeathed to the university in 1957 is equivalent to many hundreds of thousands of pounds in today's money. So that must have been before the public sector clamped down on salaries and pensions. But as for John Coffin, his father, for whom the memorial was made, until recently, nothing was really known about him or about the circumstances. Indeed, if we'd been introducing this event just a few weeks ago, it would have been said, here is a mystery to be solved. But as a result of some recent researches by Warwick Gould, our director, we now know that John Coffin was a journeyman blacksmith in the West Country. And when his wife Mary Ann gave birth to Arthur Charles, she could only make a mark on the birth certificate, implying that she couldn't read or write. And so that son, the future benefactor, became an external student at the University of London, graduating with a degree in arts in 1889. And his benefaction was directly in support of lectures in literature, history, science, and Christian ethics, literary readings, prose and poetry, chamber concerts and recitals, and publications. And his will states that he desired such events to be announced as part of the John Coffin Memorial, which I hereby do. And I think inviting Richard Holmes to speak is exactly what the Coffin family had in mind in advancing that founding aim of the University of London to widen access to the best in modern knowledge and culture from which he had benefited at the university and which his mother and father had been denied. Richard Holmes is one of the best biographers of our time, there's no doubt about that. when his first major book came out, Shelley, The Pursuit, it immediately swept away the previous Victorian tradition of Shelley as a mere lyricist, an ineffectual angel. Later, Richard turned to Coleridge and other Romantic writers and has explored the nature of biography itself, founding the MA in the subject that thrives at the University of East Anglia. But recently, Richard has turned to one of the subjects mentioned in the Coffin Bequest, the history of science. He has not abandoned the literary writers, on the contrary. He's thrown a bridge between what C.P. Snow called the two cultures, and has transformed our understanding of the Romantic writers as a result. And even when Richard writes about scientific matters, which are sometimes hard to understand, his own literary style remains as amazingly and delightfully clear and welcoming as it has always been. It's literary in the best sense of that word. I warmly commend The Age of Wonder, which is just out in paperback. His title tonight is Prometheus², not Prometheus². It's a nice mathematical title. Prometheus², The Two Shelleys and Romantic Science. Richard.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be here. I feel immensely privileged to be invited by these two distinguished organisations, the Wordsworth Trust and the Coffin Memorial Lecture. And I have to say, the thought came to mind that the Wordsworth Trust Lecture is cradled in the Coffin Lecture. Also, a little preliminary, that Michael McGregor warned me, because of the Wordsworth Lecture, that there must be at least one reference to William Wordsworth. Here it is. What the hills were to the young Wordsworth, a chemical laboratory was to the young Shelley. And that's actually from A.N. Whitehead, Science in the Modern World. And I have to lean forward and say, on behalf of Wordsworth, that actually Wordsworth and Coleridge planned to open a chemical laboratory in the Lake District so the young Humphrey Davy could work up there. That was in 1800. In fact, Davy went to the institution down in London. So Wordsworth was also interested in chemical laboratories at an early age. My interest in this subject began in this way. Some of you, I hope, saw this wonderful production of Frankenstein at the National Theatre at the South Bank with Johnny Lee Miller and Benedict Cumberbatch, who reversed the roles. And I was asked to write the program note for that, which meant rethinking in some ways the whole condition of originating a work. And of course, the Frankenstein, source of Frankenstein is well known, the famous story that Mary Shelley told. You remember the nightmare that she has, and she believes this figure is leaning over her bed, you remember, and the one yellow eye and so on. And then she wakes and she says, I've got that story. Now, I was intrigued when writing that program note because, of course, this is a retrospective account, we'll come to this, written for this third edition, in fact, of Frankenstein in 1831. And when writing this program note, I began to think more carefully about versions of how the story, the novel, originated. And I went back to Mary Shelley's journal, which of course was a shared journal with Shelley. They kept it together, it's of course been published, it's often quite difficult to tell who is writing which entry in the journal. And incidentally, they refer to each other in their letters as Mary and Shelley, and I'm going to do the same tonight. Shelley did originally call Mary Shelley Percy, and she used to call him Bysshe, but I won't use either of those terms tonight. If you look at that shared journal account, what you see is, first of all, the stages in which Mary is writing the story, and it begins at a very particular day, not at the DIODATI, but in Chamonix, in the mountains, and we'll come to that. But it also struck me, reading this much more closely, that they were reading the same sources, the same books, and not only literary ones, but scientific ones. And I began to think, here we have a young pair, young lovers, and then young husband and wife, and they're reading the same material, they're both passionate writers. And then within 2 years of each other, the two books are produced. And those are reproduction, no, the original of the original edition, first edition covers. One point I want to make that this is not an eye test, but you can see there's epigraph. Mary's epigraph, well known from Milton, of course, from that 10th book of Paradise Lost. Wonderful, wonderful thing to pick out. Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mould me, man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? A wonderful thing after the fall, there's Adam, and this great metaphysical reproach. Did I ask you to create me? And that reproach runs right through Mary's novel, Frankenstein. And in a way that epigraph sets the tone throughout. It is a novel of menace and reproach and regret in many ways. What about the Prometheus Unbound epigraph, which truly is illegible from here? It's Latin, audisne haec amphiare sub terram abdite. It's very interesting. I found it almost impossible to find in any edition a translation of that. But I tracked it down. It's from Cicero, and roughly it translates as, dost thou hear this? Amphiare is one of the ancient seers or prophets. So we could translate that as, dost thou hear this, O prophet, where thou waitest beneath the earth, sub terram abdite. And there the note is completely different, a challenge. It may reminded me of that wonderful moment in Hamlet, as thou move so quickly the earth, O Mo, the voice that comes from beneath the stage. This is a challenge to the seer, the prophet, beneath the ground. Do you hear this? Do you hear my version of Aeschylus? And again, that note of challenge, in a way dominates and commands Shelley's version of the Promethean myth. So those were, that was my starting point. And thinking very much in terms as a biographer of these two young writers, living together, reading together every night, and working together, thinking about very similar subjects. There's the DIODATI, slightly later engraving. You probably can't see it at the bottom right. There is an open-shirted figure, which is probably Byron, in fact. And that is where Mary likes us to believe that her version of the novel began. But as you go through the 1816, 1817 journals, you see a very different picture emerging. First of all, a very simple thing, just to establish Shelley's own interests in science, which Mary, 16 years old then, clearly took on. He himself owned from Oxford onwards a solar microscope and a telescope, And Mary, on his 24th birthday, which was there at the DIODATI in August 1816, very interesting, she gave him two things. One was another, better telescope, and the other was a fire balloon, subject that attracts me greatly and I've written about. And Shelley, we know, used those, that sort of perfect idea of flight, to put a poem or a, some kind of tract, some revolutionary tract, that was floated off to see where it would land. And he originally did that in Lynmouth, poignantly with his first wife, Harriet. And here is Mary giving him the same thing, a fire balloon. So they were interested and very playful with these ideas. And those two scientific objects represent that in some way. The other thing is, when you look more closely at the publication of Prometheus Unbound, it is, of course, as I showed you in the, it is and other poems. And actually, that's often forgotten. That collection, it has got the Ode to the West Wind in it, it's got the cloud in it, the sensitive plant in it. Almost all the poems in that are either to do with political liberty, or are they to do with science, certain kinds of science, meteorology, geology, astronomy. So it's a very particular collection from that point of view. So I was asking myself, what was the connection? Could we get closer? What was the connection between these set of scientific ideas and the two publications? Also, to remember that we know that Shelley himself helped edit Frankenstein, and the Bodleian, of course, has published the manuscript, which incidentally scotches the idea that some way Shelley wrote the novel. This is perfectly clear from the... He edits certain places, but it's Mary's book. But he's obviously very involved in it, and they're reading the same materials. We'll go into that in a minute. And also, he wrote the prologue, the preface, to the short preface to the novel. Remember, it was unsigned. And if you turn that round a bit, of course, Mary writes a preface to Prometheus Unbound years later in 1840. So they both write prefaces to each other's works. So that was very interesting. So I started to put that together. Let me just remind you, just to give you some image. Again, this is the biographer in me. The image on the left, Mary 1816, it's disputed, but it is in many ways accepted now, and it reminds us how young she was, but also how intelligent she was. I think it's wonderful from that point of view. And the Shelley is the current portrait, made in 1818, when he was writing the body of Prometheus Unbound. So that's just to give you their images. And if we look a little bit closer about what they shared, the ideas between those two books, there is a version of the creation myth quite clearly in both works. In Frankenstein, of course, it's a profane creation, it's a human creation, and thereby hangs the central issue of the book. But also in Prometheus Unbound, it is also a form of creation myth, because the Prometheus myth itself, which Shelley had inherited from Aeschylus, one of the elements of the Prometheus, the Firebringer, is that he actually creates mankind. And we'll have a look at that, the race of man. One of the Hesiod myths there is that Zeus, Jupiter, had created 5 races of man and destroyed each one. Very interesting if you think of that in Darwinian terms. And the 6th race was created by Prometheus under certain conditions. So there's a version of the creation myth also in Prometheus Unbound. Secondly, central to both works is a kind of confrontation between power and suffering in many ways, between Zeus and Prometheus, but also, of course, between Frankenstein and his creature. And just let me remind you of that. The central moment for me in the book is not so much the moment of creation, but it's the confrontation that takes place between Frankenstein and his creature up in the snows of the Mer de Glace. We'll have a look at that. And that is exactly when the creature asks what right did Frankenstein have to create him. And then, if you remember, the creature then demands a mate because he is hideous and lonely and he lacks affection. And that is his version of human rights. He demands that from Frankenstein. And we all know that Frankenstein agrees and then he betrays the creature. So that confrontation, which is incidentally the great piece of Mary Shelley's writing, the great arias of speech from the creature who in all the films that follow is never allowed to do more than grunt. But in the novel, in that central volume 2, that confrontation, those are magnificent speeches, and the creature imagines going away to South America with his beloved who would have been created and not bothering the race of man more, and demands this as a right. So that issue is set very brilliantly in the middle of Frankenstein. But of course, in Prometheus Unbound, there's exactly the same confrontation. We'll look at it in a little bit more detail, but you remember the basic outlines of the myth, that Prometheus has been hung, chained to the rock, and the tyrant, Zeus, will not free him because he's given fire to mankind. And in Shelley's poem, there is a confrontation. But very interestingly, it's not between Prometheus and Zeus. It's between another figure, Asia, the beloved. You see these ideas beginning to cross over. The creature acquiring a beloved. Prometheus has one, Asia. And in the Act 2, the central act, Prometheus Unbound, it is Asia who goes to demand justice. First of all, from an underground figure, who lived beneath the earth, Demogorgon, and then eventually to Jupiter himself. So again, just giving you just the broad outline there, central to Prometheus Unbound is also a confrontation between power and the demand for liberty, which gives it a very big mythic resonance. And the last thing where I think we share certain common sources is the use of particular kinds of scientific imagery, both in the novel and in the poem, and I will look at that in a bit more detail. The ordinary reading lists are mostly literary. In many of the studies, Aeschylus, Prometheus Bound, of course, which they both read, and Shelley translated as they went. Milton's Paradise Lost, you see this again and again in the reading list, which is so key because Satan is also a form of the creature and is also a form of Prometheus himself. And interestingly, often forgotten, Mary's own father, William Godwin, St. Leon, very interesting, it's a historical novel, 16th century, about a man who discovers the secrets of eternal life, the secret of eternal life, but alchemically. And again, that's closely involved with Mary's version in her novel. Let me now close in a little bit closer and look at the starting points. Again, working with the journals. Mary Shelley actually says the first time she starts the story, she calls it, Write My Story, is on the 24th and 25th of July, up in the snowy wastes of Chamonix. Here's the diary entry. Write my story. Behold, le Mer de Glace. This is the most desolate place in the world. Iced mountains surround it, no sign of vegetation. It is traversed by irregular crevices whose sides of ice appear blue, while the surface is of a dirty white. We were astonished by the world of ice that was opened to our view. We're not absolutely sure who wrote that entry, but I think it's Mary. And again, that takes us to what will be the central confrontation scene in her novel. But the interesting thing is that Shelley's own poem began in a very similar way, but in March 1818. And this time they were traveling back through Europe and into Italy, through Switzerland, and they went through one of the newly opened passes called Les Echelles, which I think had been partly opened by Napoleon. Here's a contemporary view of it. Okay, and there's a little steps through, and the coaches went down below. And this is what also appears in Mary Shelley's journal. The rocks, which cannot be less than 1,000 feet in perpendicular height, sometimes overhang the road on each side and almost shut out the sky. The scene is like that described in the Prometheus of Aeschylus. Vast rifts and caverns in granite precipices, wintry mountains with ice and snow above. I'm doing something particular here, which is I don't want to show you more than 3 lines of poetry at a time, because it is very, very difficult to take it in, particularly Shelley's poetry. So there is, it's from the opening act, almost at the beginning, about 50 lines in. The crawling glaciers pierce me with the spears of their moon-freezing crystals. The bright chains eat with their burning cold into my bones. One could perform a nice little explication of the text there. Crawling glaciers pierce me with the spears. There they are, the spears. And of course, what Shelley was drawing on was the theories of Georges Cuvier. Very interesting. It was believed that the glaciers were not retreating, as we all think about the polar bear problem, right? They believed at that time the glaciers were expanding and were going to wipe out the human communities below. So it's a reverse, and that is why the glaciers are so violent and are piercing Prometheus. Moon-freezing crystals. We'll come back to the moon. Very interesting, at this time, the moon was considered, was known to have no atmosphere, and was considered astronomically as a sort of symbol of icy cold and total infertility, death. And so those moon-freezing crystals are actually drawn from Shelley's reading of the astronomy of the time. And we could go on, the idea that the chains actually eat into his bones has some understanding of minerals at that time and oxygen and so on, oxygenation. So we could open that up. What I want to do, though, is just put these together. There's Prometheus, and there is from the central confrontation in Frankenstein, the desert mountains and dreary glaciers are my refuge. The caves of ice are a dwelling to me. These bleak skies are kinder to me than your fellow beings. And the interesting thing here, of course, is this is not Frankenstein, this is the creature. The creature appears to be in the Promethean role at this moment. There's a crossover, reverse. The creature is suffering and persecuted by the god, by the power. So again, same themes, but crossing over and dwelling on the imagery of places they visited, but also the science that they knew about them. So that's just an opening point, because the idea of origins always fascinates a biographer, and that's just to give you a glimpse into how I see that beginning. Let's just step back for a moment. The Promethean myth itself at this time, there are quite a lot of images, but they're very particular kind. This is a German Prometheus drawing. It's Prometheus the Firebringer. And the figure here is indeed, as it were, the first of the Adam of the fifth race being given life. So that's a particularly, it's sort of neoclassical in its imagery, although 1817. Just let me remind you, looking at that, of course, Prometheus the rebel rebels against Zeus and Kronos. He steals fire. He's changed the rock. But Zeus has also created 5 successive races of men, I mentioned this, which are described in Aeschylus as like ants. The men of that time are like ants, and they're destroyed. And it is Prometheus who creates and looks after the 6th race of man. And of course, the image of the firebringer, the symbol of enlightenment, of hope, very, very powerful in the Romantic period. If you go through very quickly, Goethe wrote a very interesting, quite a short lyric poem, which is Prometheus on the Rock. There's a couple of lines from it in a contemporary translation. Here I sit, forming mankind in my image, a race to be like me, to suffer, to weep, to enjoy and delight themselves, and to mock you, that's Zeus, as I mock you. And there very clearly, Prometheus creating the race that he's going to look after, who will mock Zeus, mock the power, mock the oppressor. I found that a thing I didn't know before. Beethoven wrote some music for a ballet, The Creatures of Prometheus, about the same period. Byron, of course, wrote a lyric poem, Prometheus. We think about 1816, and Trelawney, not always reliable, says that actually this was at the Diodati, and Shelley translated the Greek, as it were, over supper to Byron, who then wrote the poem. A couple of lines from that. This is Byron's poem. Thou art a symbol and a sign to mortals of their fate and force. Like thee, man is in part divine, a troubled stream from a pure source, and man in portions can foresee his own funereal destiny. And that's the gloomy section in Byron, and then he again comes to the idea of Promethean hope. That image also gets into a very important lecture by Humphrey Davy, the first lecture he gave. Do you remember I said right at the beginning that Coleridge and Wordsworth wanted him to come to a laboratory in the late 16th century? He came to the Royal Institution down here in Albemarle Street, and his introductory lecture uses the image of Prometheus, the hope who symbolizes science, the hope of science. That's in 1802. Just by way, I noticed in astronomy, this period, one of the moons of Saturn is named Prometheus, slightly forgotten, it's a minor moon. And one of the first of the asteroids, which are first discovered at this period, in 1809, we'll come back to that, William Herschel, is also named Prometheus. And then the most extraordinary thing that I found out working on Coleridge is that Coleridge's poor son, Hartley, do you remember the lovely Hartley Coleridge, who was thrown out of Oxford and wrote that wonderful poem about his father? When he came down to London, the idea was that he would work as a journalist for the London magazine. You can imagine this Coleridge, the anxious father, trying to set Hartley in his 20s up with a job. And in order to undertake this, Hartley said that he had to have something serious to do, and he would write a poetic drama. And what was it? It was Prometheus. And fragments of this do remain, written in 1820 and 21. And this is a wonderful Coleridge digression. But Coleridge was so anxious that he would write a wonderful piece that he began assembling notes on Prometheus. So Coleridge, Papa, was feeding these immensely learned notes about Aeschylus, Prometheus, to poor Hartley, aged 24, 25. No wonder the verse drama never got finished. But Coleridge actually gave it as his first lecture to the Royal Literary Fund in 1825 on the Prometheus of Aeschylus. So that just to give you the idea that the concept, the myth of Prometheus was very, very alive and generalized in this period. Shelley himself, of course, had a very particular take on it. This famous remark he made in the preface, "I was averse from a catastrophe so feeble as that of reconciling the champion with the oppressor of mankind." He couldn't accept the Aeschylean version. He couldn't accept that Prometheus should somehow come to a negotiated settlement with Zeus. That was not Shelley, and he had to work out a different way of doing it, hence the confrontation I've already mentioned, and hence this extraordinary dramatic sleight of hand that in all that poem, Prometheus Unbound, Prometheus never meets the oppressor. He never meets Zeus. It's Asia, beloved, who talks to power. We'll come to that. And a last point to be made there about Shelley's Prometheus. For him, Prometheus combined all the arts and all the sciences together. Very, very important point. He was not a two cultures figure. He was a three cultures figure. And this indeed is in the tradition that he brings technology and medicine as well as the arts. And Shelley uses this in the central act of the play to look at all the things he brings mankind under the heading of hope. And we'll have a look at that. And that wonderful remark, do you remember, he makes, "I had rather be damned with Plato and Lord Bacon than go to heaven with Paley and Malthus." Malthus much in the papers at the moment, as you know, because of the population explosion. Don't go to heaven with Plato and Malthus. Stick with Plato and Lord Bacon. And the point about Plato and Lord Bacon, Plato and Platonic imagery and ideas which do indeed fill Prometheus Unbound, but they're also set against Baconian ideas, Bacon, the great first great prophet of the scientific revolution. So he's saying exactly there, I would go be damned with Plato, the great literary philosophical figure, and Bacon, the great scientific prophetic figure, rather than the depressing Paley and Malthus, very Shelley-like. And one place, for example, another of my three lines, the play there, the perpetual Orphic song, Orpheus, of course, who is the great literary figure, the singer, the chanter, who comes back from the underworld. And Daedalus, who is, of course, the scientist, the technician, the man who builds the flying instruments and so on. And so he combines, as it were, the arts and the sciences and technology in those three lines. The harmony. Language is a perpetual Orphic song, which rules with daedal harmony a throng of thoughts and forms which else senseless and shapeless were. And that idea of bringing to sense and to shape is very important, particularly in the later part of Prometheus Unbound. So again, just three lines to indicate that. Now, what I want to do now, the time we have left, is look at specifically at some of the scientific sources they were using, they were both using. First of all, most important of all, is Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles, the polymath, he was inventor, biologist, meteorologist, everything really, who wrote this wonderful poem called The Botanic Garden, which I still have plans to get brought out in Penguin Classics, 1794, extraordinary poem in 10 cantos with these scientific notes. And it's like an encyclopedia of contemporary science. Shelley read it and read it. His first poem, Queen Mab, is based on that structure, which, remember, with the wonderful notes, the notes on free love, the notes on astronomy and so on, in Queen Mab, and they're all inspired by Erasmus Darwin. And a lot of the geological, electrical, biological imagery, which is in Prometheus Bound, comes from this extraordinary book. But not just Shelley, because if you remember, in the preface to Frankenstein, it opens with this sentence: "The event upon which this fiction is founded has been supposed by Dr. Darwin and some of the physiological writers of Germany," that he means Blumenbach, "is not of impossible occurrence." So that's the first introductory sentence to the book, saying that it is based on contemporary science in some way. it always intrigued me to find, was there an exact source? Yes, there is. It's right in the last book that Darwin, in fact, posthumously published, called wonderfully The Origin of Society, not the origin of species, the origin of society. And the first note, the first cantos, is exactly about artificial creation of life. I'll read you a tiny bit of it. From the misconception, this is Erasmus Darwin, from the misconception of the ignorant or superstitious, it has been thought somewhat profane to speak in favour of spontaneous vital production or creation, as if it contradicted Holy Writ, which says that God created all the animals and vegetables. But spontaneous vitality can be looked for in the smallest microscopic animunculi. The new discoveries of the electric jar and the galvanic battery should certainly be nicely investigated. What a wonderful challenge to a novelist to read that. And that's what Frankenstein partly does. So those sources, and there are many more, one could look in detail, but that's the first of the great scientific sources, who appears in the reading list, the journal, and also in both their letters. Let us leap forward. The astronomer, William Herschel, who I've written about a lot in The Age of Wonder. What I've tried to explain there is, of course, he's famous for discovering the seventh planet, Uranus, which he discovered in March 1781, probably with his sister Caroline alongside. But from that, he opened up a new idea of the solar system, that it might expand. He doubled it just by finding that planet. And then he went to, he's the first person who publishes papers in the Royal Society about that we're in a galaxy called the Milky Way, and there must be other galaxies outside, notably Andromeda. And this completely revolutionizes the way everybody who reads him looks at the universe, and of course Shelley read him. Very touching thing, the very last book list that Shelley sent from San Lorenzo, from Italy, from the Gulf of Spezia to Galignani in 1822, was asking for further works by William Herschel, the very last book list. And Shelley developed that idea, the idea that there must be plurality of worlds, there must be many creations, many solar systems, and thereby many other forms of life, into an atheist argument. Here's a little bit of it. The indefinite immensity of the universe is the most awful subject of contemplation. It's impossible to believe that the spirit that pervades this infinite machine begat a human son upon the body of a human woman. The works of his fingers have borne witness against him. Sirius is supposed to be 54 trillion miles from the Earth. Millions and millions of suns are ranged all around us, all attended by innumerable worlds, calm, regular, harmonious, stable harmony, all keeping the paths of immutable necessity. Now that idea, that blowing open metaphysically, philosophically, the nature of the universe and the possibilities of other creation, obviously bore on Mary's words. One of these they must have discussed. And so the idea that there could be an alternative creation suddenly becomes at least a scientific speculation. But of course, by establishment, by traditionalists, this is regarded as heretical, profane, and so on. But it's the scientific ideas that drive that. One more point about Herschel. He built this magnificent, this is a 40-foot telescope. He found the new planet. Caroline and he found the new planet with a 10-foot telescope. He made them all. He even made this one. It had the reflector image at the bottom of that, which is in the hut, had to be cast in Thames and then brought down, cast in London and brought down on the Thames, and it weighed 4 tons. And when they mounted it, it slipped and it almost fell on William. And Caroline writes an extraordinary letter about that. So he was developing these amazing instruments which could see further and further and to begin to resolve what he called the nebulae, which he realized were galaxies. And these very powerfully affected people like Shelley, who followed. Shelley Mary lived just across the Thames from this observatory. And again, just to show you one. This is what Prometheus did. He taught the implicated orbits woven of the wide wandering stars, and how the sun changes his lair, and by what secret spell the pale moon is transformed. We'll come back to that, transforming. Just pick up one thing there, the wide wandering stars. Stars is used, actually Herschel used the same. He obviously means the planets, which technically means the wanderers, as you know. And how the sun changes his lair, quite an interesting image. You think, wait a minute, the sun's in the middle. But one of the things that Herschel had established was that the solar system of the sun was itself moving through space relative to the galactics around. And that was an amazing piece of observation and mathematics. And Shelley had read it, and that's why the sun changed its lair. So just a tiny detail there. And maybe I'll just go one bit further. Well, believe that. There's always more. There's always more. The moon. We might come back to the moon. Aldini. So another scientist, Italian scientist, Professor at Bologna, the nephew of the great Galvani, produced those extraordinary batteries. Now, they knew about Aldini because of Shelley's doctor, Sir William Lawrence. And Aldini had come over from Italy with various galvanic experiments. And there's a notable one in 1803, which shocked all the British surgeons and fascinated them, is that he got permission to take the body of a criminal who'd just been executed in 1803 and bring him to his laboratory and attempt with those batteries to reanimate him. All right? Now, he'd been, hold on to your hats here. He'd been, this is in the published work, he'd been practicing this in Italy. It's not allowed in London, but these are the experiments that he'd been doing, and these are all, are forms of galvanic or voltaic batteries. Basically, they're metal discs in an acidic solution, which produces an electrical charge, basically. And there he's trying, the one I think on the top right is particularly sinister, to bring two human heads together and see in what sense he can produce life. Now, Mary and Shelley knew about this through Lawrence. And again, that I think powerfully influenced the way she conceives of Frankenstein's work. Just to show you how that image was then picked up by the readership. 1803 is a contemporary drawing of the poor criminal Foster attempting to be revived in this great experiment. And 1831 is the frontispiece to that, in fact, the third edition of Frankenstein, where you can see that is not a hairdryer. That is a piece of galvanic equipment which has been used to bring the creature, not at all how we would conceive the creature, but much closer to this scene with the fleeing, these two figures. This figure and this figure, very similarly conceived. The terror of something done in the name of science. So these are the public responses to both of the Aldini experiments and to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And this was William Lawrence, who was Shelley's doctor. Shelley was consulting him about possible tuberculosis, one of the reasons why they went to Italy. Lawrence had also translated Blumenbach, which is the German physiologist referred to in the preface to Frankenstein by Shelley. And he'd also published a very interesting book called The Natural History of Man, Lectures on Physiology, where he argued that human consciousness was simply a development of animal consciousness, his famous phrase, He said consciousness is unbroken from an oyster to a human being. It caused outrage, absolute outrage. They threatened to throw him out of the Royal College of Surgeons. He had to withdraw the book. But the argument is a completely modern one. What he says is consciousness, the mind, is a physical organization, construction that we can follow at various stages. He wouldn't use the word evolution, that's what he meant. Right through to the human child. And he argues that the consciousness and indeed conscience is developed by the education of the child, but starts just with certain what we call hardwired elements. But otherwise, there's no soul, there's no secret life force, no vitality. Now, if you think about it, that's exactly what happens to the creature. There's opening scenes. Do you remember when he escapes, he goes through a wood. He says he hears the birds, but he's got no words to name the birds. There's a wonderful passage, a marvelous bit of imagination in Mary Shelley. He looks up and he sees the moon, very important, and he thinks the moon is wonderful. It's almost the first thing of beauty he sees. And then he has no word for it. And in the first edition there's a footnote by Mary Shelley. He saw the moon. She doesn't put the moon in the text. So what Mary is working on there is very close to the theories of Lawrence about consciousness, which were published between 1816 and 1819. So there is this network of scientific thought and influence always riding on the margins of what is thought to be atheistical, objectionable, profane, always riding along that edge. The last of my 5 scientists, Davy. Davy, the great friend of Coleridge, Davy, who's going up to the laboratory lectures and so on. His book, The Elements of Chemical Philosophy, is repeatedly read by them both during this period, 1816, 17. And I think there's a lot more work to be done there. David's letters are being published, they're being edited at the moment by Tim Fulton and Sharon Ruston, and will be out, I think, first volume probably next year. And this will be major. It's going to fit a missing piece of scholarship. That bridge, William referred to the bridge, it's going to help bridge very clearly, because we see how Davy's correspondence with writers like Coleridge and Wordsworth, but also with his own scientific conversations with Byron, for example. Very interesting, Byron who writes about Davy, Byron who puts Davy in Don Juan. Wonderful stanzas about Davy and his work there. This will be established in the letters. But there's more work to be done, and one idea I throw out, if you remember in the first volume, so marvellous volume really, of Frankenstein, which is about the education of the young Frankenstein. It's the first attempt to describe the education of a scientist. If you remember that he comes to Ingolstadt with the ideas of alchemy, and then he attends the lectures of Professor Baldwin, who says, come on, alchemy is rubbish. We are working on true chemistry, with measurements and so on and so forth. And now that material is taken very directly from Davy. There's one particular wonderful essay called The Progress of Chemistry, which was given in 1812, where it almost follows paragraph for paragraph. Davy argues that chemistry began in alchemy, but gradually all that superstition was dissolved in true chemistry with Lavoisier and so on. And that's exactly the path that Mary follows in that first volume, describing the education of the young Frankenstein. But it's more than that. She takes word for word some of the lectures, and some of you will remember this is Davy. Science has bestowed on him powers which may almost be called creative, which have enabled him to modify and change the beings surrounding him, and by his experiments to interrogate nature with power, not simply as a scholar, passive and seeking only to understand her operation, but rather as a master, active with his own instruments. And then he goes on, this is still Davy. He describes the composition of the atmosphere, the properties of gases, all have been ascertained. The phenomenon of electricity has been developed. The lightning has been taken from the clouds, and lastly, new influences have been discovered which has enabled man to produce from combinations of dead matter effects which were formerly occasioned only by animal organs. Again, what a challenge to a novelist that sentence was. In Frankenstein, Waldman's lectures are directly based on that. This is now Waldman. The scientists ascend, doesn't say scientists, the chemist, doesn't say scientists because the word was not invented until 1834. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates and the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunders of heaven, mimic the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows. And that's Mary Shelley, a fictional lecturer, Waldman, in the first volume of Frankenstein. And I just want to take this one point further. There are two editions. The 1831 the one with the frontispiece makes changes in it that are often have not properly been recognised, even with the new volume editions. And what happens in the 1831 is Mary begins to demonise the scientist much more fiercely. So after that speech, which in the 1818 edition, young Frankenstein says this is a new world to me, and he goes straight on the excitement of this. In the 1831 edition, Mary adds this: such were the professor's words. Rather, let me say, such the words of the fate announced to destroy me. As he went, I felt as if my soul was grappling with a palpable enemy. One by one, the various keys were touched which formed the mechanism of my being. Chord after chord was sounded, and soon my mind was filled with one thought, one conception, one purpose. So much has been done, exclaimed the soul of Frankenstein. Far, far more will I achieve. Treading in steps already marked, I will pioneer the new way, unfold the world of the deepest mysteries of creation. And from that Gothic outburst, it's only a step to that. And that is one of the general points that I want to make this evening, that it seems to me these two works that I've been looking at together, which both draw very powerfully on the scientist, that I try very quickly to explain. The result in Mary Shelley's novel is anti-science, it's a demonization of science. And believe you me, when I'm down the other place, the Royal Society, the name of Frankenstein is not well received. But quite seriously not well received. Because the idea of the madman in the white coat is a problem that is still there in science and science education. We could perhaps come back to that further. Now, I want to just, as we close, to look by contrast with what Shelley did also with Davy's lectures. And here is a tiny extract, very similar, from a different part of that lecture. Let me move Boris away to that. This is Davy. Man in a state of nature is a creature of almost pure sensation. His life is passed in cravings or apathy or in slumber. He has no vivid feelings of hope. He is unable to discover the causes of things. He is either harassed by superstitious dreams or quietly and passively submissive to the mercy of nature and the elements. But with science, he is capable of anticipating the future, connecting hope with an infinite variety of ideas. Science has bestowed upon him powers that may almost be called creative, and there we move into the same person. So they took, Mary and Shelley, took the same passage, but different parts of it. And for Shelley, this became a great image of scientific hope. More than 3 lines. I've got 2 minutes. I really want to do this. Will you bear with it? I want to just read a passage from Prometheus, Act 2, Scene 4, where Shelley, around this passage, says what Prometheus stands for. Prometheus, the fire bringer. Prometheus, who used who presents the arts and the sciences as healing and enlightenment to mankind. Let me just read this to you. Bear with me. Bear with Shelley. Prometheus saw and waked the legioned hopes which sleep within folded Elysian flowers, nepenthe, moly, amaranth, fadeless blooms. And he tamed fire, which like some beast of prey, most terrible but lovely, played beneath the frown of man. He gave speech, and speech created thought, which is the measure of the universe. And science struck the thrones of earth and heaven, which shook but fell not. And a harmonious mind poured itself forth in all prophetic song. He told the hidden power of herbs and springs, and disease drank and slept. Death grew like sleep. He taught the implicated orbits woven of the wide wandering stars, and how the sun changes his layer, and by what secret spell the moon is transformed when her broad eye gazes not on the interlunar sea. He taught to rule as life directs the limbs, the tempest-winged chariots of the ocean ships, and the Celt knew the Indian. Cities then were built, and through their snow-like columns flowed the warm winds, and the azure ether shone, and the blue sea and shadowy hills were seen. Such the alleviations of his state Prometheus gave to man, for which he hangs, withering in destined pain. And that's the great Shelley part. There's a lot more to say, but my time is up. Let me just finish by putting some questions in front of you. Why has Frankenstein remained so popular, so incredibly popular? There are 90 film and theatre versions, 90. Right? And we may come on to the question of reception theory, where William is expert in this area. What happened? Why did it remain? Is it simply that one is in prose and one is in verse? Is it because Frankenstein has this dominating image of the creation of life? And if you don't think that that image doesn't go very far, all right, you take my point. Very simple there, very simple one. Is it also, and this is my worry, is it so powerful and popular because it is an anti-scientific book? It deals with science, but it's anti. It says science menaces. It contains hubris, arrogance. It menaces us. This is a debate that seems to me is all around us at the moment. And the novel Frankenstein plays a curious part in it. Against that, Prometheus. Very, very rarely read now. Sometimes it's on the A-level syllabus. Very, very rare. It is a difficult poem. But is that the only reason? It seems to me, particularly in the Act 4, almost all the quotations I gave you are from the amazing Act 4, which is a kind of hymn to science and hope. I didn't mention one particular image, which is that there's a wonderful passage where the moon sings. And what the moon, remember the freezing crystals, beginning. The moon comes to life in Act 4. The moon heats up, has an atmosphere, and begins to sprout plants, and becomes a sister to the earth. Extraordinary image based on HERSCHEL, his very first paper to the Royal Society, claimed that he'd seen life on the moon with one of his early telescopes. And that idea, this is very speculative, but I would say that something will happen to the moon in the next 100 years. NASA has given it up at the moment, but we will be back. And I think the idea that the moon might become in some way fertile. In some way may be used. Some may be planted. You can imagine what Mr. Philip Denham's in there with an artificial atmosphere. It sounds crazy, but it's there in Act 4, Prometheus Unbound. And it's the kind of way Shelley's mind is working. And as one last image here, Prometheus may be a difficult, obscure poem, but its time may come back. This is the next piece. Next spring, there will be a new film by Ridley Scott, the director of Alien, but this is called Prometheus. It's the one image we have. And it is about going back to find the origins of humankind. We don't know what the story is, but I leave you that image. Shelley's version may yet come back and be with us. I hope so. Thank you very much.
I can hear that we all agree that we've had a most amazing talk tonight, which has brought together science and ancient myth and the literary imagination, and has created new myths of its own, which are still very much influencing the way we see the world. Richard has thrown out some questions. He's also offered to answer questions from the floor. If anybody would like to ask a question, we can debate it. Anybody like to speak? Yes. Yes, there is a microphone.
I wondered whether your view of Mary Shelley on a personal level had changed since The Pursuit and Footsteps. I gathered that you. I just wondered what you thought of Mary generally. She seemed to come across quite badly in both books as rather a cold, intelligent but essentially cold figure, and I wondered whether you still thought that Claire Claremont was the more exciting person to be around.
Very good question. Shelley's image of Mary the moon and Claire the comet, remember. I think it's an absolutely fair criticism. I think in that first Shelley book, I was very young when I wrote it, I wanted the kind of chaos of that life, and I think I was very unfair to Mary in it. I think in Footsteps I begin to look at that again, and I certainly think now, having looked at this, the scientific roots and so on, I'm more and more impressed by Mary. I think she's quite extraordinary. It's like I said I was trying to say in that the little program note, in a way that people might understand. I said, look, this is a period where women are not allowed into university, but she was like some brilliant postgraduate at 16 years old. The way she absorbed and developed these ideas. And the thing that I didn't mention here is that while the male scientists were treating these ideas with such seriousness, there is an element of wonderful anarchic Gothic comedy in Frankenstein. And I think that that is also pure genius. I talked about the arias of human writing, that wonderful speeches that she wrote from that point of view. But there is a kind of dark comedy in it, which again, it absolutely amazes me. 16, 17, 18, 19. Occasionally I have to talk about this book in schools. I remember Wickham Abbey, the brightest girls' school, and I could lean across and said, she was younger than most of you. That's a great sensation. So it's a fair point, and my view has changed. And what I'd love to see now, and now talking about forms of biography, biography is, as we will see, it's shifting its axis rather. The big single-volume life, although there's Claire Tomlin's wonderful Dickens, which I hope you'll read, the kind of cutting edge of biography is moving around and looking often in microbiography, taking a particular passage of a life, or putting two lives together. And what I'd like to see, and it's never been done, is a life of Mary and Shelley together as two working writers. I've tried to touch on that just by working with the journals tonight. but it seems to me that would be the most fascinating subject and would make a very good critical biography. Remember, Mary subsequently writes prefaces to every one of Shelley's major poems. And of course, there's this constant dialogue. So that's what I think would be a very fair thing to do. I think it may be for somebody else to do, but it's a very good question. Thank you.
Yes?
I'd like to take up the notion of Mary Shelley also, and that is in terms of the fact that we know how she changed as she grew older. Shelley, of course, didn't have that opportunity. And one of the ways in which she changed, you have commented that she began to demonize the creature, and therefore almost to demonize scientists. That's already, of course, in the 1818 edition, in the sense that it's only about half a whole person. It's about the intellect and about the pride and the aspiration of intellect. And Mary Shelley herself, in the first volume edition, puts that epigraph, which is about the lack of love of the parent to the child, and therefore the inability of the child to properly develop. And one looks at people who admired all the scientists, like Wordsworth, and realizes that much as he approved of science, geometry, mathematics, it's all valued. Nevertheless, the important thing for the whole person, not half, is the development of feeling and the development of love. And Shelley, of course, and that is why Prometheus Unbound, it seems to me, is perhaps the more difficult, but also the more whole piece of writing, in that it contains the importance of feeling, development of feeling, the changing of feeling from revenge to forgiveness and all that. It's a much more sophisticated piece of writing. And perhaps Mary Shelley came round to the idea that her wonderful Frankenstein, in a sense, was leading people the wrong way. I wonder what you think about that.
Pamela, thank you. Very good. I like that. And of course, it's absolutely true that the young Frankenstein becomes, he doesn't become a full human being in a sense, even in the original version of the novel. But let me take this from a slightly, this worries me a bit. When I set out to write The Age of Wonder, which was exactly to build this bridge, as a biographer, what worried me was I knew the names of HERSCHEL and DAVY and so on. And I thought, were these all men in white coats who had no hearts, no emotion? And as a biographer, that really worried me. Was there material? And it's only when I began to look at their letters and their journals, particularly Davy, but also the relationship between William and Caroline and so on, I realized that the emotional life of scientists is quite as full, quite as rich, quite as anarchic as their contemporary writers and poets. So I do feel that the image of young Frankenstein as only half a person, and of course the modern developments I showed you in that very first image, was to make some comparison between Frankenstein and his creature, that they're interchangeable in the dramatized version, and they're played by actors on them. That making that very, very important point that in some way, only by putting together would you get a complete human being. But nonetheless, I think the problem does remain that it is a book that demonizes science. It is also true that Mary, I didn't leave those ideas alone. I mean, she wrote The Last Man, a book about the plague and so on, which also is very interesting and contains one of the first fictional accounts of a balloon flight, which is very much. But I do think that there are real issues there, and I think the tragedy would be if Shelley had lived, you can imagine what I see as a kind of continuing discussion between them as writers. That would produce different kinds of work from both of them. And that is one of the great abiding tragedies of that early death. And I think Mary, I mean, you've only got to read her later letters and so on, she understands that so well. And she feels half a person without him. So it's very complicated and rich, the material you touched on. And again, I come back to the idea that the book is waiting to be written, which is about the two of them together, as lovers, as husband and wife, and as writers together. And then perhaps we will have a fuller idea of that. Anyway, thanks for that question. We've got time for one more, perhaps? Over there. Right back, and then...
Well, that's just a quick question.
The microphone is there.
Thank you. You know, when the play was produced, you know, when Mary Shelley was alive in London,
yes.
you say in the book that the monster wasn't speaking or anything like that. You know, it was like the... And she wasn't a bit bothered by that. Well, surely if she was working in her heart and feeling, she would have been rather annoyed with the way the play. Have you any ideas?
Yes, you're quite right. I mean, her letters are tremendously enthusiastic. She comes back and she says, I became almost like Byron, I became famous overnight. And we're talking about, because apparently there's been Frankenstein productions up at the Wordsworth Trust, and Michael was telling me it's a great family hit. And the very interesting thing is that first production, 1823, Presumption of Frankenstein, there was a wonderful advertising campaign about it that was ran. And the most successful advert, which brought most people in, said, do not bring your daughters, do not bring your wives, do not bring your mothers. This is unsuitable, profane, and of course it packed people. The question of why, yes, why she, I think she saw it, and again, maybe William can say something about this, I think she saw the novel and the theatrical production as completely separate. She got no author's rights for it, right? And she had no way of knowing that it would go on to produce its own version, which of course more and more concentrates on the actual creation of Frankenstein and less on what Shelley himself, and they clearly thought, between them was the great theme, which in a word is, if you persecute someone, they will behave badly, they will be like Satan thrown out of heaven. And that's the kind of social, moral centre of that book. And that's why I concentrated on the confrontation, on the murder guys. That seems to me the real heart of the book. I think Mary felt that she probably looked at it as a form of advertising campaign. That's what I like to think. And how right she was. And remember, it hasn't destroyed. The novel is taught in schools where Prometheus Unbound is not. So I think it's the A-level syllabus exam this very year.
If I could come in, since you invited me a couple of times, Richard, I think the part of the point of the explanation of the huge power of Frankenstein to create this imaginary monster science is that hardly anybody read the book. If you read the whole book with the preface, it clearly says, as just been quoted, that the key message is almost a Christian one, that if you treat people as monsters, then they will become monsters. But although the book was produced in very small editions until very late in the 19th century, it was adapted for the stage straight away. And the stage versions are very, very different. They would not have been allowed to they wouldn't have been licensed by the authorities if they had stuck to the original plot, which was regarded as blasphemous. And so, whereas the novel, you write it, the author writes it and then it's fixed, as long as it's in copyright. A stage version, the fiction is created every night with the audience participating, and the various versions are changed to match what works on the night. And so the creation of the mad scientist is not so much in the novel, it's in the minds of the audiences who created that stereotype, first of all on the theatre, and then by a seamless change into the movies. Good. I don't know whether maybe we could go on for a long time, but maybe I should bring our talk to a conclusion. We all want to thank Richard very much. I think we had talked about bridges between two cultures, and then we mentioned of three cultures at one time. What I take from this evening is that we should all read Frankenstein less, go to less Frankenstein adaptations, and that we should all read Prometheus Unbound more often and more carefully. Thank you very much, Richard.